Most people don't realize how quietly life slips out of alignment, not through massive failures, but through tiny daily compromises. One skipped the morning routine, one more distraction, one more day telling yourself, I'll fix it tomorrow. And then one morning you wake up and realize you don't recognize your own life anymore. You're doing things, going through the motions, but something feels hollow, like you're moving, but not really living. It's not because you're broken, it's because your energy has been scattered so thin that you've lost your center. And that center, in Buddhism we call it sati, mindful awareness, the very heartbeat of peace. Without it, life becomes noise, but with it, every step becomes sacred. So today we're not just talking about getting your life in order, we're talking about coming home to yourself. If that's something your soul has been quietly craving, stay with me. Don't skip a single part of this video. Every moment here has something your heart already knows it needs. And if you feel like what we're building here matters, if you find peace, insight, or even just the comfort of being understood, there's one simple free way to support this path. Just hit that subscribe button. It lets us know we're walking together. Let's begin. There's a strange pressure we all carry. This idea that the answer to a better life is always something we have to go out and get. A better job, a new relationship, another book, more information. It's this constant chase to add more, but what if the peace you're searching for isn't in adding? What if it's in subtracting? Buddhism has always pointed to this. The Buddha didn't teach us how to accumulate more. He taught us how to release. He said, just as a snake sheds its skin, we must shed our past over and over again. And that applies not just to the obvious things like regret or resentment, but also to the quieter burdens, overthinking, self-comparison, perfectionism, the stuff that clutters our mind without us even noticing. Most of us are not lacking clarity because we don't know enough. We're lacking clarity because we're holding on to too much. There are too many roles we think we have to play, too many outdated definitions of success, too many fears disguised as responsibilities, and so our inner world starts to feel crowded, like trying to hear your own voice in a room full of noise. The truth is, you can't hear your intuition, your inner compass, if you never give it silence to speak into. The teachings of Buddhism remind us that everything begins with the right view, one of the elements of the Noble Eightfold Path. But you can't see clearly when your mind is full of fog, and fog comes from holding on, to thoughts, to expectations, to a version of yourself that maybe you've outgrown. Letting go isn't easy. It sounds poetic when you hear it in quotes or meditations. But in real life, it's uncomfortable. It means loosening your grip on what feels familiar. And the ego hates that. The ego wants certainty, it wants identity. But Buddhism gently shows us that identity itself is fluid, impermanent, just like everything else. So when you let go of something, be it an old habit, a toxic relationship, or even a belief about yourself, you're not losing who you are. You're uncovering who you've always been beneath the noise. You're peeling back the layers that life, fear, and conditioning have piled on top of your peace. Here's the beautiful part. Once you start to release what doesn't serve you, space opens up. And in that space, clarity arises, not forced, not chased, but revealed. That's the nature of the mind. It's like a still lake. When it's disturbed, everything gets blurry, but when it settles, it reflects truth with calm precision. The Buddha once said, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. And that's exactly what clarity is. It's a kind of peace, a sense of direction that doesn't come from a checklist, but from alignment with your inner truth. You know that feeling at the end of the day when you're exhausted, but you can't even say what you actually did. You answered texts, checked your notifications, bounced from one thing to another. Yet somehow, nothing meaningful really got done. That's not laziness, that's not failure. That's what it looks like when your energy leaks in every direction. And it's one of the most overlooked reasons people feel stuck. It's not that you lack potential, it's that your power is being slowly drained by tasks, conversations, and distractions that don't serve your deeper purpose. The truth is, without clear intention, even your best efforts can feel empty. And that's not just a productivity issue, it's a spiritual one, because where your attention goes, your life follows. Buddhism has long taught that our suffering often begins with a mind that is unfocused, scattered, pulled in too many directions. The Buddha used the image of a wild elephant, powerful but destructive when untamed. But with awareness, with mindfulness, that same elephant becomes a force of peace and purpose. Your mind, your energy, your presence, they are no different. Without training, they drift. With training, they transform your entire life. When we don't set clear intentions, the world does it for us. We scroll because it's easier than sitting with our own thoughts. We say yes to things we don't believe in because we don't want to disappoint others. We start our days reacting to emails, to messages, to demands, never once asking ourselves, what truly matters to me today? That simple question is often the difference between living and just existing. And yet most people never stop long enough to ask it. They just keep moving, trying to do more, be more, achieve more, never realizing that it's not more they need. It's alignment. Buddha taught the Noble Eightfold Path, and right intention is one of its core elements. It means directing your life from a place of wisdom, clarity, and purpose, not ego, not fear, not social pressure. But when you live without intention, it's like pouring water into a bucket full of holes. No matter how much energy you put in, you're constantly depleted. You give your time to things that don't nourish you. You commit to plans you're not excited about. You allow other people's urgency to become your emergency. And you wonder why you feel like you're constantly catching up. But it doesn't have to stay that way. The moment you begin to live intentionally, even in small ways, you start plugging those leaks. You start making choices that feed your soul instead of draining it. And it begins with something incredibly simple, asking yourself, why am I doing this? Not out of judgment, but out of curiosity. Every habit, every task, every interaction is an exchange of energy. And when you start becoming conscious of that, you naturally start pulling away from what doesn't serve you. Think of it this way, your energy is sacred. Every time you give it away without thought, you're giving away a piece of your life. In Buddhism, this awareness is called sampajanya, the clear comprehension of what you're doing and why. When you practice it, you don't just act, you act with understanding. You don't just speak, you speak with intention. You don't just move through your day, you move with purpose. It's easy to look at discipline and feel resistance. The word itself often carries a heavy weight, rigid routines, punishment for failure, a sense of forcing ourselves into uncomfortable molds. Somewhere along the line, we started treating discipline like a burden, something harsh, something we either have or we don't. But if you sit with the teachings of the Buddha, if you really take them in, you start to see discipline differently. Not as control, not as self-punishment, but as a quiet form of compassion, an act of love toward your future self. It's the part of you that sees the bigger picture and cares enough to say, I want you to be free. The Buddha didn't teach discipline as a method of suppression. He taught it as one of the pillars of the Noble Eightfold Path. Sammakamanta, right action. Samma-ajava, right livelihood. And Samma-vayama, right effort. All of these require discipline. Not to make us robotic or stripped of joy, but to help us live in alignment with truth. Because real joy doesn't come from indulgence. It comes from knowing that your actions reflect your values. It comes from the peace of not being at war with yourself. Think about it. Discipline is what gets you up before the world needs you, so you can hear your own thoughts before the noise begins. It's what reminds you to sit on the cushion, even when the mind is busy, even when it resists. It's what helps you speak the truth, even when silence would be easier. And every time you do those things, even in the smallest way, you're reinforcing an identity. The kind of person who shows up with presence, with intention, with care. That's not punishment, that's compassion in motion. The Buddha once said, to enjoy good health, to bring true happiness to one's family, to bring peace to all, one must first discipline and control one's own mind. That's where it begins, not with the world, but within. If you're waiting for motivation to arrive, you'll be stuck in cycles. But if you choose discipline, not as a weapon, but as a gentle nudge, you begin to break free from those old loops. You learn to act, not just react. You create space to live with awareness, not just drift through days. And here's something people don't talk about enough. Discipline is deeply connected to trust. Every time you follow through, even when you don't feel like it, you're teaching yourself that your words mean something, that your intentions are real, that you can be counted on by yourself. That's where confidence comes from, not from external success, but from the quiet trust that you'll show up for your own life, no matter what. In Buddhism, compassion isn't just how we treat others, it's how we treat ourselves. And sometimes, treating ourselves with kindness doesn't mean comfort. Sometimes it means setting a boundary, turning off the distractions, saying no to what numbs us so we can say yes to what frees us. That's the compassion that builds a better future. That's the discipline that heals. Some days it feels like your mind is split in 20 directions. You start one task, then check your phone. You try to focus, but a new worry sneaks in. You sit down with good intentions, only to end the day feeling like you've been busy, but achieved nothing real. This isn't laziness. It's not even a lack of effort. It's a quiet, constant war for your attention. A war most people don't even realize they're losing. The modern world feeds this fragmentation, notifications, endless content, the pressure to be available all the time. And yet, deep inside, you know that what you're really craving is presence, stillness, a sense that your actions are actually building something meaningful. Buddhism calls this anchoring of awareness, ekaggata, a mind unified on one object. This is not just a spiritual concept, it's your path back to peace. Focus isn't about forcing yourself to do something. It's about choosing what truly matters and giving it your full attention. That's the real problem, isn't it? Most of us are trying to do everything, afraid to let anything go. But in trying to hold on to everything, we drop what's essential. The Buddha taught that the mind is like a wild elephant. It must be trained gently, consistently, and with compassion. Left on its own, it wanders aimlessly. But with mindfulness and intention, it becomes your greatest ally. When you focus on one thing, whether it's your breath, a goal, or a task, you're not just being productive, you're practicing liberation. You're pulling yourself out of the storm of distractions and planting your feet in solid ground. Think of how much energy you lose each day to things that don't matter, debating with yourself whether to do the work, clicking from one tab to the next, saying yes to things your heart is clearly saying no to. This isn't just draining, it's misalignment. And when you're misaligned, everything feels harder than it should. But when you reclaim your attention, life starts to flow again. You begin to notice what lights you up and what drags you down. You start working not just harder, but more honestly. In Buddhism, this is right effort, one of the steps on the Noble Eightfold Path. It doesn't mean doing more. It means doing what's aligned with your values, your purpose, your peace. And let's be honest, it's not always easy. Sometimes the thing that deserves your focus is the thing that's most uncomfortable, sitting with your own thoughts, facing a difficult truth, finishing the project you've been avoiding. That's where real growth happens, not in the scattered doing, but in the focused becoming. Buddha never said the path was without effort, but he did say the path brings freedom. Your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own unguarded thoughts, he taught. The mind left untended becomes the source of suffering, but the mind disciplined by focus becomes the birthplace of clarity and joy. There's a kind of noise that doesn't come from the outside world. It lives inside your mind. It hums in the background as you move through the day. It shows up as scattered thoughts, looping worries, endless to-do lists, unfinished conversations, regrets and what-ifs. Most people don't even notice it anymore because they've gotten used to it. We fill every silent gap with a screen, a scroll, or a sound. It's become almost uncomfortable to be quiet, to just sit and hear nothing but our own breathing. But that discomfort, that's the very place your clarity begins. Not in doing more, but in being less distracted. Buddhism has always placed a sacred value on silence. When the Buddha left his life of royalty and comfort in search of truth, he didn't seek it in chaos. He sat beneath the Bodhi tree, alone, quiet, still. And in that stillness he found enlightenment, the kind of insight that can only arise when the noise settles and the mind stops trying to force answers. Because here's the truth: some of the most important realizations in your life won't come when you're running, talking, or even thinking. They'll come when you pause. We often mistake silence for emptiness, as if nothing is happening. But in Buddhism, silence is not a void, it's fertile ground. It's where the seeds of understanding are planted. It's where the dust of confusion begins to settle. That quiet space, that pause, is a doorway. It's the place where wisdom gently knocks, waiting to be let in. But most of us are too busy talking to hear it, too busy planning, reacting, proving. And the tragedy is we miss the truth that's been waiting for us in the quiet all along. Let's be honest, it's not easy to sit in silence. The moment things go quiet, all the buried emotions start to surface. The sadness you pushed down, the anger you ignored, the fear you tried to outrun. They rise up and ask to be felt. And that can feel overwhelming. But the Buddha didn't teach us to avoid discomfort. He taught us to observe it, to be with it, to understand it. That's the difference between suffering and liberation. When you sit with silence long enough, the discomfort starts to soften, the chaos becomes still. And underneath it all, something unexpected appears: clarity. In modern life, silence is rare. We associate it with boredom or loneliness. But spiritual silence, the kind Buddhism points to, is rich. It's not the absence of something, it's the presence of awareness. It's where your intuition has room to speak, where your mind isn't crammed with reaction but open to reflection. That's why monks retreat into silence, not because they're hiding from the world, but because they want to see the world more clearly. And not just the world outside, but the one within. You don't have to go to a monastery to experience this. Just start small. 1 minute of stillness, then 2, then 5. Sit with your breath. Notice your thoughts without judgment. Let them come and go like clouds in the sky. You don't need to empty your mind, you just need to stop pouring more in. The Buddha said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." And silence is how you start turning inward, gently, consistently, and without force. There's this quiet kind of suffering that sneaks in when we constantly resist what's already happening. We don't like where we are, so we mentally fight it. We deny it, distract from it, try to outrun it. We tell ourselves, "This shouldn't be happening," or "I'll feel better once things change." But that resistance, it creates a double weight. First, there's the pain of the situation itself. Then there's the second layer, the suffering we add by wishing it wasn't real. In Buddhism, this is called the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is what we create when we refuse to accept the pain that life sometimes brings. It sounds counterintuitive, I know. Most people think acceptance means giving up or settling, but it's the opposite. Acceptance is the first step toward real transformation. Not because you're okay with everything as it is, but because you finally stop pretending it's something it's not. The Buddha taught that dukkha, or suffering, is part of life. But he didn't stop there. He offered a path out of it. And that path begins not with control, not with fixing, but with seeing clearly, with right understanding. You can't change something you haven't fully acknowledged. You can't heal a wound you won't admit is there. Let's be real. There are things in life that are painful to look at. The job that drains you, the relationship that keeps you small, the dreams you've been avoiding because you're scared they'll never work out. But until you're honest about what isn't working, you'll stay stuck pretending that things are fine. And fine is the enemy of freedom. The Buddha compared awareness to a lamp in a dark room. It doesn't fix the room, it just shows you what's really there. Once you see it, you can begin, but not before. This kind of honesty takes courage. It's not easy to sit with discomfort without trying to fix or numb it. But that sitting, that pause, is sacred. In that stillness, something shifts. You start to see the pattern, the reason, the next step. When you stop resisting the present moment, it stops feeling like a trap. It becomes a teacher. In Buddhist practice, we call this mindful acceptance. It's not passive, it's presence. It's choosing to meet reality without flinching, without pretending, and without judgment. And here's the beautiful part. Once you accept what is, you reclaim your power. Instead of being tossed around by life, you're grounded in clarity. You can now respond instead of react. You can make decisions based on truth, not fear. You can begin to transform not out of desperation, but out of deep, conscious alignment. That's where real change lives, not in fantasy or escape, but in meeting the moment exactly as it is and saying, okay, this is where I am. Now let's begin. There's this pressure we all carry, this silent belief that if we're going to change our lives, it has to be all at once, like there's a switch we're supposed to flip, a perfect routine we need to start tomorrow, a version of ourselves we need to become overnight. And when we can't keep up with that expectation, when the transformation doesn't happen fast enough, we start thinking something is wrong with us. But the Buddha never taught us to chase sudden transformation. He taught the middle way, a path of balance, of steady mindful progress. That means we don't need to force a dramatic change to reclaim our peace. We just need to begin, right here, right now, with one small intentional step. The world we live in glorifies extremes, all or nothing thinking, 10-year life plans, hustle or rest, perfection or failure. But in Buddhism, there's wisdom in simplicity. The Dhammapada says, a jug fills drop by drop. One step today may not seem like much, but when taken consistently, that one step becomes a rhythm. That rhythm becomes a habit, and that habit, it becomes a path. A path you walk not in leaps, but with presence. You're not supposed to have it all figured out. You're supposed to take the next honest step in front of you and trust that the path will unfold as you walk. Sometimes the smallest decisions carry the most weight. Drinking a glass of water instead of skipping breakfast, sitting in silence for 3 minutes instead of reaching for your phone, saying no to one more draining commitment. These aren't grand gestures, but they're declarations. They tell your mind and your heart, I matter. This moment matters. That's how you start to build a life that feels aligned, not through chasing intensity, but by choosing presence again and again. You see, change doesn't start with the end result. It starts with identity, and identity isn't some mystical thing you find one day. It's something you earn by acting in alignment with the person you want to become. The Buddha didn't become enlightened through one moment of glory. It was years of sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, in stillness, in discomfort, in persistence. And what that shows us is simple but powerful. You don't become peaceful by waiting to feel peaceful. You become peaceful by taking peaceful actions, even when the world feels chaotic. One breath, one pause, one mindful choice. A lot of people say, "I'll start when I'm ready." But what if readiness isn't something that arrives? What if readiness is something you create by acting? You don't feel confident before taking action. You feel confident because you took action. And you don't feel capable by thinking about it. You feel capable when you do the hard thing anyway, especially when it's uncomfortable. Even the Buddha taught that effort is essential. No one saves us but ourselves. No one can and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. You know what's strange? You can have food on the table, a roof over your head, people who care about you, and still feel like something's missing. That sense of emptiness isn't always because your life is lacking, but because your mind has forgotten how to see what's already there. In Buddhism, this is where the practice of appreciative awareness becomes life-changing. The Buddha taught that craving, this constant reaching for more, is the root of suffering. But what he also taught, and what we often overlook, is that freedom from suffering begins the moment we start to truly recognize the gifts already in our hands. We live in a world that trains us to focus on what's wrong, the missed deadlines, the things we don't have, the way someone didn't treat us the way we hoped. We scroll through social media, comparing, judging, wishing. And slowly, without realizing it, our brain becomes wired to notice only the gaps, the flaws, the disappointments. But the Buddha offered a different path. He taught that the mind, like a garden, will grow what you plant in it. If you constantly plant thoughts of lack, your inner world becomes a desert. But if you plant gratitude, even for the smallest things, you water the seeds of contentment, and they start to bloom. Gratitude in its truest form isn't just saying thank you. It's not about pretending everything is perfect or ignoring pain. It's about shifting the way we see. It's about choosing, again and again, to bring mindful attention to what is supporting you right now. Maybe it's the quiet breath you didn't notice you were taking. Maybe it's the warmth of sunlight coming through the window. Maybe it's the lesson hidden in a difficult conversation you had yesterday. When you slow down enough to notice these things, your nervous system softens, your perspective widens, and life begins to feel less like something you're fighting and more like something you're in relationship with. There's a reason why so many Buddhist teachers begin and end their day with gratitude. It resets the mind, it realigns the heart. It reminds us that peace isn't some distant achievement, but something we can tap into even in the middle of the storm. Think of it like this. The world outside may be noisy and chaotic, but gratitude is the still point inside of you that brings clarity. It's the reminder that not all is broken, even when things feel uncertain, and that alone can be enough to shift your whole day. Let's be honest, practicing gratitude when things are going well is easy. The real transformation happens when you can find even one thing to be grateful for in the middle of difficulty. That's when it becomes powerful. The Buddha often spoke of dukkha, the inevitable stress and suffering of life. But he never said we had to drown in it. Gratitude is one of the ways we learn to float. It doesn't remove the pain, but it helps us carry it differently. Instead of collapsing under what's heavy, we remember what's holding us up. That shift in attention, however small, is often enough to change everything. There's this quiet lie that so many of us have been conditioned to believe, that we need to become someone else before we can start, that we need to be more confident, more disciplined, more perfect, whatever that means, before we're allowed to take the first step. So we wait. We wait for the fear to go away. We wait for the timing to feel right. We wait to be chosen, validated, or saved. But what if the truth is the exact opposite? What if it's not about waiting to become ready, but realizing that the readiness comes from taking the step itself? In Buddhism, the path to awakening begins not with having all the answers, but with right intention, a willingness to see clearly and walk forward with mindfulness. The Buddha never promised that the journey would be without fear. He simply taught that liberation starts within, and the only moment you ever truly have control over is this one, not the past, not the future, just this moment. So the question isn't, am I ready? The question is, am I willing to begin from where I am with everything I have and everything I lack? The most powerful transformations don't begin with confidence, they begin with courage, quiet, sometimes shaky courage. The kind that says, I'm tired of running in circles. I may not know everything, but I know I can't stay here anymore. That moment where discomfort turns into decision is the spark. It's not grand or cinematic, it's usually messy, but it's real, and that realness is enough. The Buddha taught that even a single drop of water, added again and again, can eventually fill a large container. Your small efforts matter. Your tiny moments of progress matter. They're not signs of weakness. They're proof of your commitment to show up for yourself. Let go of the illusion that change has to be dramatic to be meaningful. The world sells us this idea of overnight reinvention, transformations that look perfect in highlight reels. But Buddhism reminds us that the most lasting change is subtle, intentional, and internal. It's the kind of change that happens when you shift your mindset from punishment to practice, from urgency to presence, from waiting to walking. The lotus, after all, doesn't bloom overnight. It rises slowly through the mud toward the light. So maybe the first step for you isn't creating a perfect plan. Maybe it's choosing to sit quietly for 5 minutes and breathe. Maybe it's journaling one honest thought. Maybe it's finally unfollowing the voices that make you feel small and returning to your own. That counts. That matters. It's not about impressing anyone. It's about remembering yourself. One of the most freeing truths in Buddhist wisdom is the idea of non-attachment, the ability to hold space for imperfection without letting it define you. You don't need to be free from fear to begin. You just need to stop letting fear make your decisions. You don't need to know exactly where this path leads. You just need to trust that the path will reveal itself with each mindful step. And you certainly don't need to become someone else to feel worthy of walking it. You don't need to have it all figured out to take the next step. You just need to believe that your journey is still worth walking. Even the smallest act of alignment can echo through your entire life. So trust this moment, honor it, and let it carry you forward. If your heart feels even a little bit lighter after this, there's more waiting for you. Watch one of the suggested videos on the screen to keep walking this path with us. And thank you truly for being a part of Buddhist Journey.